Hello, my dear students. Welcome to My Edgar Academy. Today, in this session, we are going to discuss some questions on the chapter Matter in Our Surroundings. So, let's move on to our first question. The question is, a sponge is considered as a solid because the options given are, it has mass, it has volume, it has shape and fixed boundaries, all of the above. As you know, sponge is a material that has mass, isn't it? So it has its own mass. It requires a space to occupy, isn't it? So it has its own volume. And as you can see in this figure, it has its own fixed boundaries. So it has fixed boundaries for itself. So according to our question, the first three options are true about a sponge. So we can write that D as the correct answer. Now, let's move on to our second question. The question is, which of the following examples show all the properties given below? The first property, definite shape. Second, definite volume. Third, less compressibility. And fourth, less space between the particles. As you have already learned in your school video, that these given statements are the peculiar properties of solids. That is, solids have a definite shape, solids have a definite volume, solids are less compressible, and solids have less space in between their particles. So, we need to choose whether the given options are solids or not. Our first option tells us that water vapor, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. As you know, all the three given materials are gases, isn't it? So, A is not our required option. Option B tells us kerosene, water, honey, and milk. What are they? They are all liquids. Yes. So, this is also not our required option. Option C tells us that salt, water, potassium permanganate crystal, and honey, in which salt and potassium permanganate crystal are solids, but water and honey are liquids. So this option can also be neglected. And option D tells us that potassium permanganate crystal, salt, sugar, and copper sulfate. We know all the four given materials are solids. So our required option is option D. Now let's move on to the third question. The question is, which of the following statements are correct regarding solid? So our first statement is, solids take the shape of container in which it is kept. Second one, solids have a definite volume. Third, solids have less space between the particles. And the final one, solids can flow. We need to analyze these statements and check whether they are right or wrong. So in order to answer this question, I am inviting your attention to this slide. Here you can see an apple. And what I am going to do is, I am going to take a container and going to place 4 apples in it. You can see that the shape of the apples are not going to change to the shape of the container in which it is kept, isn't it? So our first statement is wrong. And the second statement tells us that solids have a definite volume. As you can see here, all the apples require its own space to occupy, and that means it has its own volume. So we can say that solids have its own volume. So the second statement is true. And the third statement is, solids have less space between the particles. Here you can see a solid and the particle arrangement in it. As you can see here, the particles are tightly packed here. That means there is less vacant space in between the particles, and the force of attraction between the particles is very large. So our third statement is also true. And the fourth statement tells us that solids can flow. As you know, only if the particles are widely separated, then only it can flow. As the particles of solids are tightly packed, it cannot flow. So our fourth statement is wrong. So the right answer is that second and third statements are true. So the correct option is option D. Moving on to our next question. Next is an assertion and reason type question. Here there will be two statements given as assertion and reason. We need to check whether those statements are true and whether the reason is the perfect explanation for the assertion. And we need to choose the right option from the options given below. Our assertion is, a rock piece cannot be compressed using our hands, whereas a sponge can be compressed. And the reason tells us that sponge has an elastic property like rubber bands. In order to answer this question, I am inviting your attention to this figure. Here you can see a little girl is trying to compress a rock as well as a sponge. She won't be able to compress the rock, isn't it? Because rock has less compressibility. But sponge being a solid, but it has a lot of vacant space in between its physical structure. That means she can easily compress the sponge. So, in our question, our assertion is true. But the reason tells us that sponge has an elastic property like rubber bands. Every material has its own elastic properties. Sponge also has. But it is not that stretchable or compressible when compared to that of a rubber band. So our reason is wrong. So our required option is option C. That is, our assertion is true, but our reason is wrong. Moving to the next question. Next is a passage. Let's read the passage first. A goldsmith working aside the road noticed that a mechanic on the other side of the road easily handles a tire with his hands. He used to press it, fit it, compress it, etc. But a goldsmith cannot compress or press a gold piece by his hands to make jewelry. We need to analyze this passage and answer some questions on behalf of this. Our first question is, the tire is made of polymer. Name the monomer unit present in the polymer. The options are isoprene, terylene, acrylonitrile and ethene. As you know, monomer is the smallest repeating units of polymer. In this case, tire is made from a polymer known as natural rubber. So, we need to understand or analyze what is the monomer used to make natural rubber. Terylene is a synthetic polymer that is used to make plastic bottles, nets, etc. And acrylonitrile is another synthetic fiber which is a monomer of polyacrylonitrile. And ethene is the monomer of polyethylene or polythene used to make plastic bottles and covers. So our required answer is option A, isoprene. Moving to the second question on the basis of that passage. The question is, pick out the odd one out of the following. Options: modeling clay, rubber bands, tire and balloons. In these given options, rubber bands, tire and balloons, which are made of rubber, we know that it can be stretched and compressed easily. All those materials has very high elasticity. But modeling clay has less elasticity as well as it cannot be stretched or compressed. So the odd one out will be option A, modeling clay. In this session, we had discussed some questions on the chapter Matter in Our Surroundings. Hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.